Welcome to the lecture on hierarchical data visualization, part of the Principles of Data Visualization lecture series. Now, the first thing we're going to do is all kind of get on the same page, align some common terms for what hierarchical visualization is. So, hierarchical visualization gets its name from a hierarchy. So it's going to have different levels, and we're going to visualize on those different levels. Now, a couple of the key elements that must exist in order to do this type of visualization. The first one is called an ordered set. So we have to have basically a set of values in a particular order. Second component is we have to have an ordered subset. So take one of the values from the original ordered set, and then we create an ordered set from a portion of the ordered set. And you can think about it as sort of a hierarchical set of pie charts. The ordered set might have 3 different pieces to the pie, and then the subset takes a slice of the original pie and says there's different components within this slice. Now, with hierarchical visualization, the elements are organized in relationship to each other. So that's a fancy way of saying the values are all in relationship or proportion to each other. The elements or values are organized in relationship to the whole. So just like when we create a pie chart, the different components, if there's 3 slices of pie, they have to all add up to 100%. The same thing holds true when we do hierarchical visualization. And we can think of some forms of hierarchical visualization, particularly the tree map, as a dynamic multi-tiered pie chart. And we're going to come back to that concept and explain it, but this just sort of introduces some of the important concepts that are required to do this style of visualization. So a taxonomy of different hierarchy systems. So the first type of system is called a Cartesian system, and we're going to be working with this extensively in this lecture. We've previously discussed a node-link layout, node-link diagrams, so we see one on the left-hand side there, and if we use a particular approach to a node-link layout, we have parents on top, children underneath them, grandchildren, different subcomponents, etc. If we turn that on its side, we have what's called a dendrogram. We could also have an indented layout, so we know those from a table of contents, let's say in a book. We can also have a style called a cone tree that takes a higher level component and splits it out. Moving to the right there, we could have what's called an icicle tree. So we have a whole of something there at the top. It has subcomponents, and then within it, it may have different value representations that basically icicle down, which is where the name comes from. And then finally on the right-hand side is our tree map, which is probably the most popular type and one that we're going to spend the most time on. Some other systems, they're polar systems, so we see a node-link radial layout, a radial icicle or sunburst, which shares some elements with our discussion on coxcomb diagrams, and some other geometries. So we have the 3D hyperbolic tree, as well as on the right-hand side, the Voronoi tree map. So lots of different examples there. I encourage you guys to read further on this taxonomy and the Marilla's Design for Information text. It's a very useful text that I think you'll enjoy. And so let's dig a little deeper into some of these that have ready applications for business. So the example of the node link layout, we know very well as an organization chart. So we have a hierarchy relationship of classes only. And so as an example, we have our HR vice president here at UT Dallas. We might have a class of directors underneath that vice president, and then a class of administrators underneath our directors there. Now, this can be fairly useful as long as the number of data values is not too large. A couple of things that the organization chart does not do. It does not provide percentage contribution. So I cannot really tell from this organization chart if Marita Yancey, our Director of Benefits, is actually 50% of the scope of work of Colleen Dutton. I really can't tell that with an organization chart. It's really not designed to answer that question or visualize that. So it's a little bit less effective for large data sets, and it doesn't really provide me with percentage contribution. Now let's talk a little bit about the history of the tree map. So the tree map was created by an academic researcher named Ben Snyderman. And Ben Snyderman had set out to solve a problem of space allocation of computer files on a storage drive. So the user experience was one that you knew when you were about to run out of space or when you had run out of space, but you didn't really have a good way to determine, well, how much space have I allocated to different files? And this was the problem that Snyderman set out to solve. So a couple of different iterations in solving this problem. So in figure 1, you see a 3-level tree structure. The numbers indicate the size of each leaf node. So you can think about it as file size or the folder size. How much space is it taking up is just labeled on the different nodes. Then we look at figure 2. So this is a tree map of figure 1. So our tree map basically takes a shape like a rectangle and then divides all of those different file sizes or folder sizes up into ratios that are representative of the comparative file sizes of each, and basically allocates the file size, basically the data, as a proportion of area that's represented in that tree map. And here's how some of the early designs of that tree map looked. And for those of you guys that have studied sort of the history of the Macintosh computer, you will notice the telltale design of the original Macintosh window that you see here, and the representation of the tree map with file sizes and folder sizes represented as area. Now the tree map was a really good thing, but it wasn't perfect. And along came Martin Wattenberg that worked on a particular application to solve an optimization or one of the problems with the original definition of the tree map. So that particular problem was of the high aspect ratio comparison. So if we look at figure 1, sort of the typical slice and dice layout. We see lots of different file or folder sizes. They're kind of all stacked there, but they don't necessarily have a rhyme or reason to them. You can compare them, but it's a little bit difficult to compare them. And so Wattenberg improved on the tree map and created the new layout scheme. And the way that scheme works is you have sort of this nested approach where we see large squares. So it looks like there's about, in this diagram, about nine or 10 large squares. And then we have subclasses of squares within it, and then subclasses within that. And this was the particular problem that Wattenberg's approach solved. And from there, Wattenberg took this design and created what has become known as a map of the market. So this map of the market project commissioned by Smart Money, which was a media publication, magazine that was basically focused on individual investing. This particular project was designed to be used by very large traders of stock, of equity. And it works kind of like this. So the map of the market is an overview of all of the companies that are traded on the U.S. stock exchange. Now, the first categorization you can see is by industry. So the large squares are divided up into healthcare, financial, energy, utilities, consumer cyclicals, technology, capital goods, basic materials, transports, communication, and consumer staples. So different industries or different industry groups. Within each industry group, you'll have a number of different companies. So you might think about these as Fortune 500 or Fortune 1000 companies. And each one of those smaller squares within the large square represents the market capitalization or size of that company. And so you can compare sort of smaller companies to larger companies. And then, as you might have noticed, color encoding is utilized significantly here, where green means that that particular security, that stock, is increasing in price on that particular day. If it's red, it's decreasing in price, and if it's black, it's neutral. Okay, and there's a few other encodings, and so let's go through the whole sort of map of market definition. So the area is allocated by market capitalization. So the market capitalization of the industry relative to other industries is defined by area. The market capitalization of a particular company in reference to its other companies is defined by area. And then it's organized, large blocks by industry sectors of the market. The weight of the lines defines sectors versus the company. So we see our industry sectors have much thicker lines between them than the lines between our smaller blocks for our companies. Color highlights are advancing with green or declining with red, share price. And then color is assigned based on a percentage change of the share price. So we have different shades of red and green, depending on how much the price has gone up or down in that particular day. So originally, labels were defined as company names and ticker symbols. That was the original design, but the labels were eventually removed for better visibility. And then that particular design was purchased. So this map of the market was purchased by MarketWatch, and a redesign was performed by Greg Kubler. And you can see that this redesign made a few adjustments here. Probably the first notable adjustment is that the particular industry sector has a header, so it sort of moves that out of the way, puts it on top of the industry box. As well, there is no sort of black or absence of coloration used here. Instead, it's a green to red or red to green scale. So everything is some shade of red or green. And then to provide a little bit more information, there's a tooltip on each one of the squares that we have highlighted there that gives you the particulars on that company, particularly as it relates to the share price, what the movement is, so we can see at this particular moment the share price for EOG Resources is $167.13. It is increased in price today. That's why we see the green arrow, and it looks like it's gone up a little over $1, about 1%, something like that. And we can hover on any of these squares to get the equivalent information. Now let's talk a little bit about different points of view of data visualization. So our friend Edward Tufte, that we began this semester discussing, had a critique of this particular data visualization. So Edward Tufte suggested that he had a strong preference for what he called a super table. Basically wanted a lot more data in front of folks, and a preference for spark lines, a concept he called spark lines, which are like little trend lines next to some tabular data values. Tufte also suggested or criticized that each stock needed labels, that you didn't really know what you were looking at unless you had a label on it. And probably the largest critique that Tufte made is that there's an overweighting of recent results, which is known as a recency bias. And so what Tufte is speaking to, and to a certain extent, the problems that are being solved in Tufte's mind is a little bit different than the problem being solved in Wattenberg's mind. So the problem in Tufte's mind is what stock should I buy? And what Tufte is suggesting here with the critique of recency bias is this particular data visualization only looks at the current. It's only looking at what's happening today and doesn't provide any information on what's happened in history previously. And so there's a very strong bias toward whatever's happening today, even though we might have some very useful data and information from a trend standpoint or a historical pattern standpoint that might inform our decision making on buying a stock or not. So these are some of the critiques of Tufte. The creator, Martin Wattenberg, responds, and I think this is a good example of how data visualization critique works. Critique is quite common in the Viz community, and often this approach is used to learn more about what is useful. So Wattenberg responds. The first thing that Wattenberg responds with is that the super users of this particular data visualization are using it at a very high rate of speed. This is a tool that is built for traders of large blocks of equity that have a particular job to do in a very short period of time. They may show up to the office and they have to trade $5 million worth of stock for one company on that day. And what this particular data visualization is designed for, Wattenberg suggests, is for these super users that need to trade blocks of stock and then see if it has an effect on what's going on in the market in general. And for everyone's benefit, that trader's job is made difficult by the reality that as soon as they start trading a significant amount of stock, the market will adjust to it. So if you're selling that particular stock and you need to sell a lot of it, and the buyers know that you need to sell a lot of it, they're going to offer you less. And vice versa, if you need to buy a lot of stock and the sellers know that you need to buy a lot of it, the price is going to go up. And those are just simple mechanics of a market. The second thing that Wattenberg suggests is that this visualization is a weather report for the stock market. Basically, is it raining, sun shining, what's going on in the market? So it's more of a weather report than a long-term analysis. The objective is one of glanceability, which should resonate with those of you that have studied creating dashboards with me. So Wattenberg has designed this data visualization to be useful at a glance. Wattenberg suggests that the labels were removed to avoid interference. So basically, he wanted to get them out of the way so you could see the area representation of the shares. And then the final response that Wattenberg provides is that these are expert users, and they understand the layout of this particular map as well as any of us understand the geographic layout of the United States map. They know it so well that they could tell you exactly which shares or which company that square is within an industry without even using the tooltip, because they know the relative size of the players in that industry. So Wattenberg makes a fairly strong response. And I thought what we might do is just take a quick look at the two different approaches that each suggest. So we see the map of the market. That's our green and red visualization in the top left of our slide here. What Tufte has recommended is a super table. So you'll see that on the right-hand side of the screen. So that super table is defined as how different groups voted for president. So there are all kinds of different demographic groups, how they might have voted. And then Tufte also suggests the inclusion of a spark line that is his creation. And you see that down at the bottom of the screen. We see share prices, both the opening and the closing, with that little trend line in between them that Tufte coined the spark line. So I will let you guys think about that and decide for yourself what the best way to visualize different types of information is. But what I'd suggest to you is through this debate, each of these individuals is really trying to solve a different problem. So Wattenberg is trying to solve a problem for folks that need to tell the weather and need to see what the weather is for lots of different companies across this particular map in a short period of time, in the span of a day. What Tufte is speaking to, he's trying to solve a little bit different problem in that he wants to provide as much information as possible on everything that's gone on with a particular share of stock to give you a feel for what the perhaps what the low price was over the last 52 weeks, what the high price was, what the pattern was over that year with the spark line, and maybe what the beginning price was at the beginning of the year and the ending price at the end of the year. Maybe something more like that. So while a healthy debate, I think the resolution of it is that both of these visualization greats were trying to solve different problems. Now, the latest incarnation of using the tree map for financial visualization is the FinViz map of the market. And this particular website, FinViz, has taken this concept to pretty much to an exceptional place where it's highly useful for both U.S. as well as global markets. And we'll go out and take a look at that. So here we have the FinViz website, our latest incarnation of the map of the market. So a couple different things that we'll see here. So we're engaged with the S&P 500. You'll notice the different industry sectors. So we have technology, services, basic materials, consumer goods, financial. So that's the industry, and then within it, we have our companies. So here we have Google, Facebook, Microsoft, AT&T, Verizon. So we have these organized, and notice that the largest are basically organized from the top left, and they'll move in a particular pattern or organization of largest, next largest, etc., down to the smallest. And we might also notice here that there's a blended approach here of using the labels and not using the labels when they get too small, which is fairly thoughtful, fairly good design. And then as well, the different industries are also sorted and allocated based on their size. And you'll see the utility industry, much smaller industry sector, much smaller than the technology. And that's why technology is in the top left and utilities are here in the bottom right. And then you may have noticed as I've been bouncing around, if we highlight on a particular company, we can see the spark line that Tufte had suggested. So in many ways, this FinViz tree map is the ultimate in that many of the critiques that Tufte provided have been integrated here, where we see the spark line as well as the share price and what the percentage increase or decrease might be. So very nice. And then we also have a measure of how much increase or decrease based on the color encoding. So there's a metric that goes with it as well. So here we have a particular technology, a data visualization called the news map. And the news map organizes different news stories that are going on in that particular day into categories, and then visualizes them in a tree map data visualization based on those different categories. So some of the organizing principle here, we have different categories like red is world, gold is national, business is green, sort of a blue-green, sports is this dark blue. And then we see the actual storylines or articles. They make up the subcategory. So within here we have sports. Within the sports category, we have a story about the Philadelphia Eagles shocking the New England Patriots in a football competition. We see here another story about the New York Giants loss, a story about the Pittsburgh Steelers, one about the Jets. One of the important things to highlight is there is a difference between popularity of, say, this story and this story. There are a lot more journalists writing about this story than this one. Now, the news map also provides a filter. So I can go into the news map and just select the categories that I'm interested in. So here we've selected, for example, technology and business. That's what we're interested in. And we're just taking a look at those two. But it also reorganizes the area into relative ratios of how many journalists are writing about a particular topic. Now, if we click on one of those particular articles, it will provide a drill down for the story title. We can drill into the story and read the full content of that particular story. Now, some of the news map functionality. How is it put together? So the space allocation is based on the number of related stories. So the overall category, how many stories are involved in that category, they compare them all at that particular time, and whichever category, whether it's world or sports or technology or business, has the most stories, that makes it to the top left-hand quadrant. Notice that they're rectangular versus square categories. We do have some squares, but heavy usage of rectangular categories. This is using a data feed from Google News. So we always need to keep in mind, well, what's the bias of a particular data visualization? And this one doesn't have any particular overt bias other than the fact that this is news stories that are being aggregated by Google News. So there may be a whole bunch of stories out there that are not aggregated by Google News that would not make it to this particular news map. So we need to be aware of that just from a scope standpoint. We have filtering, so we can do filtering by country, by major news topic, and then we also have drill down into a single story if we're interested in that particular topic. So now let's take a look at the news map. So the news map is the usage of a tree map for news. And so the way this is organized is the large squares are defined as topics. So we can see there's a lot of news, national news, that's the color encoding for this particular set of news stories. World has quite a bit going on in it as well, followed by sports. And so these are sized based on the activity or number of articles that are going on. And then as well, each one of these squares is allocated toward the popularity of this particular topic for stories. So you can see here in this particular topic, this particular headline, let's see if we can get that going again. There are over 1,166 related articles to this story. Now this one's a little bit less. This one's just a little bit over 1,000. And then if we take a look at the Stephen Colbert poking fun at Mike Pence story, there's just 150 related articles to it. So you can see that the relative area of each is defined by the number of related articles. On the global scene, we can see this is no doubt the most popular story leading today, with roughly almost 1,300 people writing about it. This particular story, 458. This one, 426. And then we might bring it down to, with Brexit, it looks like only about 50 journalists are writing about Brexit today. Now, we also have some navigation options. So it may be that, I just don't get into the news that much because it's often negative and it kind of brings me down. So maybe I change my view. And I'm all about business and technology. I'm really not into sports that much. I have a tough time getting to the movies. I do care a little bit about my health, but it's mostly about business and technology. So I just leave these on, and the tree map reorganizes itself into equivalent relationships of these stories, organized in a tree map. So this is an example of how the Procter & Gamble Corporation has utilized the tree map style of data visualization. So what we're looking at here is a heat map. It's divided up into different countries. So Procter & Gamble is a very large multinational, as many of you guys may already know. It operates in dozens of countries. And so one of their most important things to know is how are they performing in each country, and specifically, how are different classes of products, different divisions performing within each country. So as an example, we might take a look at country A. Notice those are represented generically, but we would think about that as maybe the United States or Canada or Germany, the UK, etc. And within each one of the countries, we have those classes of products, and they're also defined across a color spectrum. Now, the encoding on the color spectrum is based on a metric called ship share, which is kind of like market share, except how much product is shipped. So it takes a little bit more of a distribution approach to it. And we can see how the ratings are there. So if it's empty, it's defined in gray. Minimum or up to 80%, it's in pink or red. Then neutral is right around 100, and then if it's more than they expected to ship, it's going to be highlighted in green. So we see varying degrees of performance in different categories in different countries. So it looks like in country A, at least in the laundry product line or product group, they're performing a little bit above average, a little bit above the 100. There's some other areas, hair care, home care, blades and razors, that are probably a little below what they expected to ship. So we can see the relative size of these different product categories or divisions in relationship to each other in that country. And remember, that can vary from country to country, and how they're performing. So it's a pretty effective use of a type of heat map. And where we get the name for the heat map is we can see for example, the different heat highlighted in colors. Now, an overview of that P&G example. The space allocation is based on corporate revenue. So however large that particular country is in terms of revenue compared to other countries is how the space will be allocated. The major blocks are defined by the revenue in that particular country or market. The minor blocks are defined by the revenue in particular product categories. And then the color heat map index is defined by market share. Or more specifically, ship share is what they called it. But what that is basically a metric. If they're going to maintain their market share, they need to be at 100. If they're below 100, they may be losing market share. And if they're above 100, they may be gaining market share based on the index that they've put together. Now, this is a data visualization using a tree map to help illustrate a particular phenomenon that's going on related to parking offshore profits. So this gets into basically how tax structures have been set up by multinational corporations in different countries. And what we see here is a comparison of 22 companies on the left to another 285 companies in the S&P 500 index. And what the point here is that the 22 largest companies for parking overseas profits basically account for the same amount of profit parking overseas as the next 285 companies. So it's trying to, the point of the visualization is try and communicate the scale. Now, a couple of things that we might notice here. So we have color encoding is used on the left to help highlight that. And there seems to be a particular bias toward highlighting some of the technology companies. So we see there Microsoft, Apple, and IBM, all fairly large amounts of profits that are held overseas. But it is a little bit curious as well in that we see General Electric significantly larger than all of them, basically the size of Apple and IBM put together in terms of their profit parking. Pfizer is considerably bigger than Apple and IBM in terms of offshore profit parking, just a little bit under Microsoft. And so there is a little bit of perspective or bias that's going into this, wanting to draw our attention to those three examples, which may be or maybe not appropriate based on your perspective of this issue. So taking a look at some of the functionality that's utilized, the encoding that's utilized in this visualization. So space allocation is based on the amount of offshore profits held in dollars. There's then a comparison of 22 companies to 285 companies, and then color is used to highlight the 22 companies versus the gray contrast on the right-hand side. Now, this is an example of a tree map that was put out by Bloomberg Visual Data. This provides overall a set of companies. In this case, it's some of the largest companies in the world by market capitalization. And it assigns different colors based on what the market capitalization is. And so as an example, Apple and Google might be some of the largest capitalized organizations versus some of those over on the right-hand side corner of the screen that might have lower market capitalizations. And we can also look at the same type tree map by price and earnings ratio. So here we can see who has the best price to earnings ratio. It's sorted that way. And then there can also carry with each of those boxes its coloration that was defined previously. And so you'll see the same basic pattern with the largest market cap organizations in the top left and the smallest in the bottom right. Now, a little bit about how this visualization was encoded. So it's ranked in assigned space based on the selection of market capitalization or sales, also known as revenue, or total assets. So those are some of the choices for assigning space. Color can then be applied based on the selection of a particular measure. For example, size, performance, or growth. And based on those different selections, the different companies will organize themselves from the largest in the top left to the smallest in the bottom right and color code themselves. All right, so let's move on and discuss the basic structure of a tree map. So with the tree map, we would want to assume an array. So let's assume we have an array of a measurement of 20, a value of 20, a value of 30, and a value of 50. And so with the basic tree map, it might lay out like the very largest is in the top left there, so that's the 50. Then it might move to the 20 and then the 30, basically laying out that basic tree map structure. Now a tree map, its structure converts an array of numbers into a space-filling map. Now the size of components are a ratio of the set members. So if we look at the different members, so 20 is 2/3 of 30 in terms of space allocation is maybe the best way to take a look at that or describe it. Space is allocated based on the ratios, so the square footage or square inches or pixels are based on the ratios. Space is allocated to the named categories in the set, so we may have that particular category, but it may be part of a larger category as well. And the tree map structure is ideal for representing large amounts of values as part of a whole. So if you think about, we have 100% of something and we want to know which components help make that up. Tree map's a good example of a visualization that can help us there. So let's take a look at that, how some of that lays out. So here we have different objects. So name Alice, value 50. Name Alice, value 10. Name Alice, value 40. So you can see those highlighted in green in the tree map. Name Steve, values 20. Name Steve, values 30. So we see those highlighted in yellow. And then finally, we have Harry with the value of 50. And those are all laid out appropriately based on that multi-level tree map. Now remember, this is part of adding the whole. So moving from a tree to a tree map basically provides the whole, the 100%, the whole entire aspect or everything that's a part of this. So tree maps help us to understand percentage contributions very well, where percentages are defined at each level of the hierarchy. So here's an example, sort of a comparison of the macro pie chart with comparison. So I like to describe the tree map as like a great big multi-leveled drill down pie chart. So if we look on the left there, we might have class 1. It's 100%. It has blue, red, and green. Then in subclass 2, I might take all of the blue and subdivide it, making 3 components up for that 100%, which is really just 50% of class 1. And then I can do the same process again, where I take one of those pieces of pie, drill down into it, and represent the 100% of different categories that make up that particular subclass object. Over on the right-hand side, we pretty much do the same thing, and we've done this intentionally, where we have 3 different categories. They all add up to 100%. So we have 50%, 25%, 25%. So we might take that section of 25%, drill down into it, and we have 3 components that make up that 25% that all add up to 100% of that area or that measurement. And then from there, we take one of the smaller categories of the subclass 2 and turn that into subclass 3, which has a division of different percentage categories as well. Now that we have this concept, we'll take a look at a hierarchical tree map. So this would be level 1. And in the hierarchy, we have different stores. So these are the stores on campus where you can buy food. They're divided up by store name. We can proceed into level 2. And within level 2, we have the store name as well as the category that was being purchased. And then at level 3, we have the different products that may be sold by that particular store. So we have in class level 3 the store name, the category, basically menu items of what we can order in those different restaurants. Now this is an example of a detailed tree map with many of these different items all filled in. So we can tell from the color coding at the bottom which particular items are sold from which restaurant, because we've color encoded the restaurant. And we can see the relative amount of how much is being sold in each one of those particular locations. Perhaps slightly less busy. This is a detailed tree map category. So we basically selected the food court data, and then we are basically looking at these different items to figure out what do people like the most on campus. And at least from this particular data visualization, it appears that Subway is the most popular option, Chick-fil-A sandwich second, perhaps waffle fries is third, and then 12 nuggets and 8 nuggets follow that in terms of different size or area that's represented. Now let's take a little look at a little bit different, maybe a little bit more fun, maybe a little broader point of view about inflation and spending, and what are the different categories that Americans spend money on. So here we have a little different example of a tree map. This is a Voronoi diagram of spending, predominantly of all of inflation's little parts. The Bureau of Labor Statistics gathers together a whole bunch of prices about everything that everyone buys Lots of different categories, things like gasoline, higher education, garbage collection, etc. And that forms the consumer price index. And we base a lot of things on the CPI to determine, for example, if we're going to increase the rate of Social Security, the monthly payments of Social Security, a number of other things in the economy. So when we're looking at this is a picture of an average consumer spending in each of the categories that they spend in. The color shows the change in prices. So we see if it's encoded in yellow or red, there's been quite a bit of inflation at that particular point in time. And if it's in the blue, it's actually had a deflationary effect on that particular category. So some of the categories we could look at here. So we have major categories like food and beverage, miscellaneous, recreation, education, communication, housing. So you can see housing makes up probably the largest aspect or largest category of individual spending. Perhaps transportation is second, which would make sense. We have to buy or rent a car or pay for the public transportation, so that's going to be fairly expensive. And then also healthcare and apparel. So we see the major categories, and those are highlighted or separated by the thick lines. That's how we see the difference in the categories. And that's we saw the same thing in the rectangular or square tree maps. And then each of the categories within it receives its appropriate space allocation based on how much that particular area is of spending. So to provide an overview of how this overall visualization is encoding, the space allocation is based on a percentage of spending. So each of these is divided up into its own percentage of spending out of 100. So remember that sort of out of the whole is a big part of what we're doing with tree maps. The major blocks are defined by spending categories that we just walked through. Minor blocks are defined by spending subcategories, so basically the subcategories within that major category. The weight of the lines defines whether we're separating categories, the large categories, or subcategories. Color encodes the amount of percentage price increase, so whether there's inflation or not, inflation or deflation. And then we have tooltips that help us define what is the spending category, the percentage share of spend in that category, and the annual percentage change in price for that category. There's an overview of the things we just discussed, and then we'll go ahead and summarize for tree maps. So in summary, there are several different types of hierarchical visualizations. We have the tree or the node link, gives us relationships. The tree map improves upon that and provides us both relationships and a percentage of the whole. And so this is where it comes on. It's sort of like a nested pie chart, if you will. So the tree map's fairly sophisticated way. We can see categories, subcategories, and represent that spatially with area on the screen to know the relative difference between them. And tree maps in general are designed to provide a percentage of the whole in comparison of the different categories within. This concludes the lecture on hierarchical data visualization.